5 African countries have wooed Moody's ratings agency on tangible progress on credit-enhancing long-term institutional reforms taken. As such, the ratings agency has a positive outlook on Tanzania, Angola, Cote d'Ivoire, eSwatini and Nigeria. Joining us for greater perspective on these territories and their credit-enhancing reforms is John Walsh, analyst at Moody's Ratings. Thank you so much for your time, John. Would you say that Africa is entering a new dimension of credit resilience, or just not yet, just that we're just seeing positive signs at this point?
No, I think that's a bit premature to say, to go that far. Africa is still subject to considerable global risks, and we've seen that in recent years, starting with the COVID shock, and then we had the inflationary shock, and then just as governments had borrowed heavily to respond to those two shocks, there was the global interest rate shock, which has challenged debt affordability. But despite these risks and risks moving forward as well, particularly geopolitical risk or domestic social risks, we have identified these 5 countries as perhaps some good news stories in the reforms that they have taken. And despite these global shocks, we have taken positive actions on these countries, a couple upgrades and a couple positive outlooks as well. And that is really as a result of the reform agenda that they have, to varying degrees, successfully implemented to date.
John, let's talk about some of those reforms, maybe starting from an institutional perspective, because of course we know that strong institutions are good for environments that are bombarded by shocks, the kind of shocks that we've seen over the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, certainly. In our sovereign rating methodology, we have 4 pillars, and one of those pillars is institutions and governance strength. And it really reinforces the other pillars, because stronger institutions can reinforce economic growth and attract investment. They also improve public financial management and ensure that governments maintain the debt burdens within the reasonable bounds. And then they also increase the government's ability to make those necessary adjustments when these shocks do happen. So the reforms that we focused on in this report were those institutional reforms around improving fiscal performance, for example, or monetary policy reforms, or what we group as other institutional reforms, particularly around state-owned enterprise governance and control of corruption.
Yeah, well, actually talking about those pillars, I want to zoom into monetary policy, price stability and foreign exchange. Also, of course, those are playing a role as well. We know that in some African countries there are heavy issues when it comes to currency devaluation and poor liquidity. So talk to us about the efforts to turn this ship around. And is it a marathon more than a sprint?
Yeah, across all of these reforms, they're really slow moving, but when they are successfully implemented, they can be durable and longer lasting, and really reinforce other aspects of the credit profile. So for these monetary policy reforms, particularly, for example, in Nigeria, what we're seeing is the reunification of the exchange rate and efforts to improve access to foreign exchange within the economy, which eventually could lead to higher investment, particularly foreign investment, and improved economic growth. And then, of course, with higher growth comes higher government revenues. But in the meantime, there are implementation risks with these reforms, and we see those playing out in Nigeria as they are having short-term economic shocks on the economy and increasing cost of living pressures for the population. But then beyond access to foreign exchange reserves, we're also seeing other sovereigns improving their monetary framework more broadly. So particularly in Tanzania, what we're seeing there is modernization of the monetary policy framework, which in our view should help ensure price stability moving forward. And then with higher price stability, you get more encouragement for domestic savings, and then more access to capital for businesses and consumers.
With the strong institutions and some of the reforms that you've made mention of, John, of course, it comes just the willingness for good governance, corruption also being rooted out. Let's talk about some of the progress you've observed in these 5 countries in that regard, and maybe even, how we are seeing that cultural shift, because corruption can be deeply culturally embedded.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we do note that these reforms are slow moving, but when they are successful, the outcomes can be long lasting. Um, Particularly with regards to corruption, that can weigh on various aspects of a country's credit profile, but not least of which it reduces the population's confidence in their institutions and in their governance. So what we're seeing in some of the countries that we noted in the report, so notably Angola, Tanzania, and Cote d'Ivoire, those third-party indicators that we look at for measuring corruption, so they're provided by the Worldwide Governance Indicators as well as Transparency International. Efforts made over time in some of these jurisdictions are leading to improvements in these indicators, albeit from a low level and still weak compared to global peers.
Well, I do hope that our leaders in South Africa have their ears perked up, because we know that South Africa is no stranger to challenges in terms of SOE governance and corruption. John, I mean, as much as it seems that things are moving in the right direction, the credit profiles of these countries are still below investment grade. What will it take to get to the other side?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's important to note that these countries that we've made note of in this report, they are withstanding the negative credit pressures that have been impacting the continent broadly, thanks to these institutional reforms. But those negative credit pressures are still there and are still in place. In terms of what would support improvements to investment grade, it's really continuing on this reform path of reform momentum and continuing to implement these often difficult and time-consuming and can sometimes be costly reforms, as over time they do reinforce resilience to shocks. And from us here at Moody's, that is something that will be watching for. So can these governments continue on this reform path? Will they maintain this reform momentum? And will these reforms be resilient to shocks, or will we see backsliding and a return to more short-term thinking?
Well, John, a pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you so much for taking us through this rather important one. That was John Walsh, analyst at Moody's Ratings.